The night sky above Huntsville shimmered like a sea of scattered diamonds, each one a whisper of distant worlds that men like Earl Henderson once dreamed of reaching. Inside the Marshall Space Flight Center, the lights burned long past midnight. The hum of machinery blended with the soft clatter of tools. In the heart of it all, Earl stood alone beside a prototype engine, his hands moving with the ease of a pianist who had rehearsed the same melody for years. The air smelled of warm metal and ozone. To anyone else, this was just another test night. But to Earl, it was everything he had ever loved: motion, precision, and the faint possibility of touching the stars. He was 56 that year, though most of his colleagues guessed younger. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, straight-backed, calm, eyes full of purpose. Or maybe it was the way he could listen to a machine and somehow understand what it was trying to say. His co-workers used a joke that Earl didn't fix engines. He spoke to them. That wasn't far from the truth. Ever since he was a boy, growing up in a one-street town in Alabama, he had felt that engines were alive, beating hearts of steel and fire that only needed the right hands to keep them steady. His father had owned a small repair shop where farmers brought their broken tractors, their trucks, even the occasional radio. Earl would sit cross-legged by the workbench, watching his father coax life out of rusted parts. "Listen, boy," his father would say, "machines tell you what's wrong. You just got to shut up long enough to hear it." That lesson had guided him more than any degree or manual ever could. When he joined NASA, fresh-faced and full of wild ideas, he brought that same intuition into a world dominated by formulas and equations. He wasn't the kind of engineer who impressed people with jargon. He impressed them with results. That night, as he calibrated the hybrid propulsion system, a fellow engineer named Daniel leaned in through the glass window of the test chamber. "Earl, you've been at that thing for 10 hours. You sure she's ready?" Earl smiled faintly. "If she ain't ready now, she'll never be." He pressed the ignition key, and the engine roared to life, a low, controlled thunder that shook the floor beneath their feet. The dials lit up, pressure steady, output perfect. For a few breathless seconds, everyone in the room forgot the world outside. They watched, wide-eyed, as the machine sang its deep metallic song. When the test ended, applause broke out across the chamber. Earl simply nodded, took a breath, and shut the engine down with care, as if tucking in a child for sleep. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it again, old man. You'll never retire at this rate." Earl chuckled softly. "Maybe one day, but not until I know she's perfect." He didn't know then how close that day really was. In the months that followed, budget meetings became more frequent than engine tests. Memos arrived with words like downsizing, reallocation, and program termination. Rumors spread that entire departments were being cut. The hybrid propulsion division, Earl's division, was on the chopping block. One morning, his supervisor called him into the office. The man avoided eye contact as he spoke. "Earl, you know how it is. We're moving resources to newer projects. The shuttle program's changing. They want younger teams." Earl didn't say a word. He just nodded, stood, and shook the man's hand. As he walked out of the office, he glanced one last time at the rocket blueprints pinned along the corridor walls. His blueprints, his life's work. He had spent decades pushing the boundaries of what an engine could do. But now the future was being handed over to people who didn't even know what a carburetor smelled like. That night, he stayed in the workshop long after everyone else had gone home. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. He ran his hand along the smooth curve of the engine casing and whispered, "Guess it's just you and me again." He tightened one last bolt, wiped his hands clean, and left his badge on the workbench. Outside, the wind was cool, carrying the faint sound of cicadas. He stood beneath the massive NASA sign and looked up at the stars he had once helped reach. Then he turned and walked away, each step echoing like the slow ticking of a clock marking the end of an era. The years that followed passed quietly. Earl moved back to Montgomery, where the land was flat and the air smelled like motor oil and pine. He bought an old gas station that had gone out of business and turned it into a small auto shop. He painted the sign himself: Earl's Auto Fix, tire patching, oil change, nothing fancy. He didn't want to impress anyone. He just wanted to keep fixing things. At first, business was slow. Locals drove past, glancing curiously at the gray-haired man bent over an engine. Some stopped, mostly farmers and delivery drivers, asking for small repairs. Earl never charged much. Sometimes he fixed things for free, saying only, "It's good practice." Soon, word spread that the quiet man at the edge of town had magic hands. He could fix engines others gave up on. Yet no one knew who he truly was. To them, he was just a kind old mechanic with grease under his nails. They didn't know that in a dusty drawer inside his shop lay framed photos from his NASA days. Rockets towering against the sky, blueprints filled with his handwriting, and a group shot of him standing beside a prototype engine with the words Marshall Propulsion Division, 1987 stamped across it. Sometimes, late at night, when the shop was silent, he would take those photos out and study them in the lamplight. Then, with a small smile, he'd put them back and whisper, "That was then." Life in Montgomery was simple but not lonely. The local kids would stop by to ask questions about their bicycles, and Earl would show them how to oil chains and check air pressure. A few neighbors came by for coffee and conversation. The walls of the shop carried the soft hum of an old radio that played blues and gospel through crackling speakers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Still, every now and then, when he heard the distant sound of a jet slicing through the clouds, he felt that familiar ache in his chest. It wasn't regret. It was remembrance. He had once built things meant to touch the heavens, and now he worked on machines that never left the ground. But perhaps that was all right. Not everything worth building had to fly. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled in. Rain beat against the tin roof as Earl worked on an old Chevy. The owner, a kind woman named Mrs. Green, watched nervously. "You sure you don't need help, Earl?" she asked. He grinned. "You want to hand me a wrench? I won't say no." She passed him the tool, and in minutes, the engine coughed back to life. She laughed in disbelief. "You're a miracle worker." He wiped his hands. "Nah, just been doing this a long time." When she left, he sat on his stool, staring at the rain sliding down the windows. The years had softened him, but they hadn't dulled his skill. He thought of Daniel sometimes, wondered where his old colleagues had ended up. Maybe they were still building things. Maybe they'd forgotten him. Either way, he was content in his corner of the world. Until one day, everything changed. It was a blistering July afternoon when the sound of screeching tires shattered the calm. A sleek, silver Mercedes S-Class coasted into view, smoke pouring from its hood. Earl wiped his hands and stepped outside, just as a young man in a suit slammed the car door. The heat shimmered off the asphalt. The man glanced around at the weathered building and frowned. "You the mechanic?" Earl nodded. "That's what the sign says." The man sighed, frustrated. "Look, my car just died on me. I'm supposed to be in Birmingham in an hour. You got a tow truck?" Earl shook his head. "No truck, but I can take a look." The man hesitated, glancing at the peeling paint, the dented toolbox, the grease-stained overalls. "No offense, sir, but this car is a bit out of your league." Earl's eyes twinkled. "Maybe, but it's still just an engine. They all breathe the same way." He walked toward the Mercedes, already hearing the faint, uneven hum beneath the silence. The young man crossed his arms, half skeptical, half desperate. Earl popped the hood, leaned in, and in that instant the years fell away. The smell of fuel, the weight of the wrench in his hand. It was like coming home. He listened, touched, adjusted. A small flick of the coil, a twist of the valve. Then, without warning, the car roared back to life, purring like a well-fed cat. The man stared, speechless. How did you?" Earl simply smiled, stepping back as the engine steadied. "She just needed someone to listen." That was all he said. But as the man looked at him, confusion turning into disbelief, something in Earl's quiet confidence hinted at a past far greater than any small-town mechanic could claim. And that is where the story truly begins, where an ordinary encounter on a sweltering afternoon will soon peel back the layers of a man the world had forgotten and reveal that the one fixing cars in a backroad garage once built the engines that touched the stars. The afternoon sun hung low over Montgomery, washing the town in shades of gold and dust. Cicadas sang from the oak trees that lined the cracked road leading to Earl's Auto Fix. The silver Mercedes had long disappeared down that road, its driver still glancing in the rearview mirror as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened back there. How a quiet old man with oil-stained fingers had coaxed his luxury machine back to life in less time than it took to pour a cup of coffee. Earl stood in the doorway of his shop for a long while after the car vanished, one hand resting on the frame, his thumb rubbing a streak of grease off the wood. The hum of the newly revived engine still echoed in his head, not as noise, but as music, an affirmation that he still had it, that the instincts which once powered the rockets of men still pulsed in his veins. He went back inside. The air was thick with the familiar sense of his small kingdom. Rubber, oil, coffee, and faint tobacco from the cigar he never lit, but kept in his breast pocket for company. His radio was still playing softly in the background, a gospel singer crooning about mercy and time. Earl lowered himself into the old wooden chair behind the counter, listening. He didn't smile, exactly, but the corners of his mouth softened. The world didn't applaud him anymore, but the machines still did. They understood. They always had. That night, he stayed later than usual. He organized his wrenches by size, wiped every socket clean, and checked the air compressor even though it didn't need checking. His hands needed motion. Stillness made room for memories, and memories could sting. As he worked, he caught himself thinking about the young man with the Mercedes. How his tone had carried that same arrogance Earl had once seen in boardrooms filled with executives who'd never turn a wrench but still told him how his engine should run. The difference now was that Earl didn't have to listen to them. Out here, he fixed things his own way, on his own time. He switched off the radio, grabbed his jacket, and locked the shop for the night. The metal door clanged shut with a finality that comforted him. He lived in a small house behind the garage, one bedroom and a porch where he sometimes sat watching freight trains pass in the distance. As he walked toward the porch, fireflies blinked across the tall grass like tiny sparks from some cosmic engine. He paused for a moment, breathing in the scent of rain still lingering from the storm earlier that week. The stars above were faint tonight, blurred by summer haze. He looked up at them anyway, tracing the constellations by habit, his lips moving in quiet recognition. Still burning, he whispered. Then he went inside. The next morning began with the low rumble of a pickup pulling into the yard. Earl stepped out with his coffee mug in hand, squinting into the sunlight. It was Sam Decker, one of his regulars, a farmer whose old Chevy was more rust than metal, but still clung to life. "Morning, Earl," Sam called, climbing out. "She's cuffing again." Earl grinned. "That truck's been cuffing for 20 years, Sam. You just keep feeding her bad gas." Sam laughed, slapping the hood affectionately. "You fix her up, and I'll switch to the good stuff." "Maybe." Earl took a sip of his coffee, nodded toward the bay. "Pull her in." As the truck rolled forward, he caught a glimpse of his sign through the windshield. Earl's Auto Fix, tire patching, oil change, nothing fancy. The paint was peeling now, the letters fading under years of sun. He made a mental note to repaint it soon, maybe add something small beneath it. "We listen to engines." That phrase had been running through his mind lately, like a heartbeat. By noon, the garage was alive with the rhythm of work. Tools clinked, the compressor hissed, and the air smelled of diesel and sweat. Earl lost himself in the tasks, checking carburetors, tightening bolts, cleaning spark plugs. Each job was its own small universe of order and understanding. People came and went, some chatting, some just nodding, always leaving a little lighter than they arrived. It wasn't much, but it was community. Between customers, he'd sit on his stool by the window and jot notes in a worn notebook. Some pages were lists of parts and costs. Others were sketches of ideas, tiny engine diagrams, airflow systems, pressure adjustments that had no reason to exist anymore except that he couldn't stop thinking about them. Once, he'd drawn something that looked suspiciously like an early blueprint for a hybrid system. He'd chuckled at himself and closed the book. Old habits died hard. That evening, a small crowd gathered near the diner down the road. Earl wandered there sometimes for supper, but tonight he stood at a distance, watching. The people laughing inside were young, mechanics from a new auto chain that had opened 3 miles away. He'd heard about them. Shiny equipment, Fancy uniforms, computer diagnostics for everything. They didn't get their hands dirty. They just plugged a car into a machine and waited for an answer. Earl had seen that before, too, back when engineers started trusting computers more than intuition. It always ended the same way. Machines made things faster, but not better. He turned back toward his garage, the gravel crunching under his boots. The neon light above the door flickered faintly, humming like a tired friend trying to stay awake. He gave it a pat, as if to say hang in there, then stepped inside. The air was cooler now, the shop quiet except for the ticking of cooling engines. He poured himself another cup of coffee, sat down, and looked at the empty space where the Mercedes had been that afternoon. Something about that encounter gnawed at him. Not anger, but curiosity. The young man's disbelief, his condescending tone, it wasn't new. Earl had seen that same look decades ago from men who thought brilliance only came in lab coats and boardrooms. Maybe that's why fixing that car had felt so good. It wasn't pride. It was proof. He got up and walked to the back of the shop, where an old metal cabinet stood. Inside were relics of another life. Papers yellowed with age, photos, letters, a folded NASA badge. He took out one photograph, a group of engineers standing in front of a massive rocket engine. His younger self stood near the center, eyes bright, hair still dark, a streak of grease on his cheek even then. He smiled faintly. "You still got it, old man," he muttered to the photo. A knock on the door startled him. He tucked the photo back into the cabinet and turned. A small figure stood in the doorway, a boy no older than 12, holding a broken bicycle. "Mr. Earl," the boy said timidly. Chain slipped again. Earl chuckled. "Bring her in." He spent the next 10 minutes fixing the chain while the boy watched in awe. "You fix cars and bikes?" the boy asked. "Anything that moves," Earl replied. When the job was done, the boy grinned. "You're better than my dad's mechanic." Earl smiled. "Don't tell him that." The boy left, and the sound of his bicycle wheels faded down the road. Earl watched until he was gone, then turned back to the quiet shop. It wasn't lost on him that the world was changing faster than he could keep up with. But that didn't matter. He didn't need to chase it anymore. He'd spent his youth chasing progress until it left him behind. Now he chased nothing, just peace, one repaired engine at a time. Later that week, the young man with the Mercedes returned. The car rolled into the yard, polished to perfection. Earl was under a pickup when he heard the engine and recognized the smooth, confident growl immediately. He slid out, wiping his hands. The man stepped out, less hurried this time. "Hey, Mr. Earl, right?" he said. "Mind if I talk to you for a minute?" Earl nodded, setting down his wrench. "Sure thing." The man hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to thank you again. The dealership said they wouldn't have figured out that issue without replacing the entire module. You saved me a fortune." Earl shrugged. "Didn't save you. Save the car. She's the one worth keeping alive." The man smiled awkwardly, then glanced around. "Can I ask you something? How did you know what was wrong? You didn't even use any diagnostic tools." Earl leaned against the workbench. "I used the oldest tool there is. Listening." The man frowned. "Listening?" Earl nodded. "Engines talk. Some whisper, some scream. You just gotta pay attention. The rest is experience." The man's eyes flicked toward the NASA photo pinned on the back wall. He stepped closer, squinting. "Wait, that's you." Earl said nothing. "You work for NASA?" Earl sighed. "Long time ago. Don't matter now." The man turned back to him, disbelief giving way to admiration. "That's incredible. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wouldn't have fixed your car any faster," Earl said simply. The young man laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You know, people like you don't exist anymore." Earl looked out through the open garage door toward the fading sky. "Sure we do. We're just quieter now." The man nodded, then extended his hand. "I'm Daniel, by the way." Earl took it. His grip was strong, steady. "Good to meet you, Daniel. Drive careful next time." As the Mercedes pulled away, Earl stood there, the handshake still lingering in his palm. Something told him this wouldn't be the last time he saw Daniel. There was curiosity in the man's eyes, curiosity and a hint of guilt. People like Daniel, raised in a world of convenience and speed, rarely met someone who reminded them what patience looked like. When night fell, Earl closed up the shop and walked out onto the road. The air was cool, the smell of cut grass drifting from nearby fields. He could hear distant music from the diner, laughter spilling into the quiet. For a moment, he felt an ache in his chest. Not loneliness, exactly, but the soft pull of memory. He thought of the engines he'd built for NASA, the men he'd worked with, the endless nights of invention and failure and triumph. He wondered if any of them ever thought of him now, this old mechanic patching up trucks on the side of the road. He sat on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand, and watched the fireflies flicker across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cried out, long and mournful. He closed his eyes and listened. It was the same sound he'd heard as a boy, the sound that had once made him dream of motion, of escape, of stars. He smiled faintly. Maybe he hadn't walked away from the stars after all. Maybe he just brought a piece of them down here, where ordinary people still needed a little bit of wonder to keep going. The next morning, the town would wake to find a fresh coat of paint on his shop sign. The new words beneath his name would read, "We listen to engines." And before long, people would come from farther and farther away, not just for repairs, but for something rarer, for honesty, for human hands, for the quiet genius who never stopped believing that even the simplest machine had a soul. The morning sun rose slow and heavy over Montgomery, its light creeping through the dusty blinds of Earl's small house behind the garage. The world outside stirred, the distant rumble of delivery trucks, the rhythmic chirp of cicadas already awake too early for their own comfort, and somewhere far off, the faint whistle of a freight train carving through the horizon. Earl woke to all of it, his mind ticking like a well-tuned machine, already listing what needed doing before the heat thickened into that suffocating southern noon. He brewed his coffee strong and black, poured into the same dented metal mug he'd used since his NASA days, and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled like gasoline and wet earth. Out beyond the road, the morning mist was lifting, revealing the faded sign over his shop. Earl's Auto Fix, tire patching, oil change, nothing fancy. The fresh coat of paint he'd added last week still gleamed faintly under the rising light. Beneath it, the new words he had carefully brushed by hand, "We listen to engines," stood clean and proud. He liked the sound of that. It wasn't just a slogan. It was truth. Earl took a sip of coffee and watched the town come alive. The postman's truck rattled past, honking twice in greeting. Across the street, the Jenkins boy ran late for the school bus again, his backpack flapping as he sprinted. The rhythm of small-town life was predictable, and that predictability was a comfort to him. After decades spent in labs where every day was a fight against deadlines and physics, he preferred this, the steady, honest hum of ordinary days. He didn't know it yet, but this morning would not be ordinary. By 10 o'clock, the air shimmered with heat. Earl was under the hood of a battered Ford when he heard it. That smooth, commanding growl of precision German engineering. He didn't even have to look up. He knew the sound now. The silver Mercedes. He slid out from under the Ford, wiping sweat from his brow, and saw the car pull into his yard. The driver's window rolled down, and Daniel stepped out. Same sharp suit, though the tie was loosened this time, and his expression carried less arrogance and more curiosity. "Morning, Mr. Earl," he said, a little uncertainly. "You busy?" Earl leaned against the truck. "Always. But I got time." Daniel smiled, awkward but genuine. "Thought I'd stop by. You, saved me from a real disaster last week. Figured I owed you more than just a handshake." Earl shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "She's running fine?" "Better than ever." Daniel walked closer, glancing around the shop. His eyes landed on the shelves, stacked with old manuals and tools older than he was. "I've never seen a place like this. You run this all by yourself?" "Always have," Earl said, picking up a wrench. "Don't need much help when you take your time." Daniel chuckled. "You know, most shops these days rely on diagnostics and computer scans. My dealership guys plug a car in, wait for the machine to tell them what's wrong, then charge triple for fixing it." Earl's hands didn't stop moving. That's the problem with people who stop listening. They let machines do their thinking for them. There was a silence between them, comfortable somehow. Daniel watched as Earl adjusted a small valve on the Ford, his movements deliberate and calm. Every gesture carried the weight of experience, like a man who'd learned patience from the stars themselves. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I saw that photo the other day. You really work for NASA? Earl hesitated. He didn't like talking about the past. But something in Daniel's tone, more wonder than intrusion, softened his usual guard. A long time ago, he said, before the suits and the cuts, before they started building engines without a soul. Daniel leaned against the wall, intrigued. What did you do there? Earl set down the wrench, wiped his hands, and looked out the open bay door toward the highway stretching out of town. I built things that flew, he said quietly. Engines for lunar rovers, hybrid prototypes that were supposed to carry men farther than anyone had gone before. We believed we were part of something bigger. He smiled faintly. Guess we were for a while. Daniel was silent. He'd grown up in a world where technology meant convenience, not wonder. The idea of one man shaping the heart of a machine that touched space, it stirred something in him he didn't expect. Why'd you stop? He finally asked. Earl's smile faded. I didn't stop. They did. Budgets ran dry. New management came in. They said my ideas were old-fashioned, wanted algorithms to replace instinct. He turned back to the truck, his voice steady but distant. So, I left before they could tell me what I was worth. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then said softly, That's incredible, though. You went from NASA to this. He gestured at the garage. And you still look proud? Earl looked at him, one eyebrow raised. Son, pride's not about where you work. It's about how you work. The simplicity of the statement hit Daniel harder than he expected. He thought about his own job, corporate strategy, endless emails, numbers on screens that never meant anything real. The contrast between his world and Earl's was staggering. Here was a man who'd been to the very edge of human invention, and he was content fixing carburetors in a one-room shop. They talked for another hour, about engines, about change, about how machines could teach patience if you let them. At one point, Earl poured Daniel a cup of coffee from his old percolator. It tasted like oil and nostalgia. Daniel drank it anyway. When he finally stood to leave, he reached into his wallet. At least let me pay you this time, he said. Earl waved him off. You start paying for conversations, the world gets too expensive. Daniel laughed, shook his head, and turned to go. But before he climbed back into his Mercedes, he paused. You know, Mr. Earl, he said, you should tell people your story. Folks ought to know who you really are. Earl smiled faintly. They know enough. My engines talk for me. Daniel nodded, though part of him wasn't satisfied with that answer. He got into his car and drove away. The sound of the engine, his engine, Earl's creation, fading into the distance. That night, Earl sat on the porch again, the day's heat still clinging to the air. The sky above was streaked with the orange and violet hues of dusk. He held a photo in his hands, the same one Daniel had seen. The men in it were all smiling, arms slung over each other's shoulders, proud, young, hopeful. Some were probably gone now. Others retired, scattered across states, their names forgotten like his. He traced his own face in the photo with a trembling finger. You sure took the long road home, he murmured. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up. Headlights approached, cutting through the twilight. For a brief moment, he thought Daniel had returned. But it wasn't the silver Mercedes this time. It was a police cruiser. The car stopped at the edge of his property, and a young officer stepped out, hat in hand. Evening, sir, the officer said. Sorry to bother you. We're checking the area. There's been a series of break-ins along Route 5. You see anything unusual? Earl shook his head. Just engines and bugs, officer. Nothing more unusual than that. The young man smiled politely. All right then. You take care. Earl nodded, but before the officer could leave, he asked, You drive that cruiser yourself? Or does the department keep her tuned? The officer laughed. She's all mine, but she's been giving me trouble lately. You work on police cars too? Earl stood, his back straight despite the years. A car's a car. Bring her by some time. As the cruiser drove off, Earl felt a small spark of satisfaction. Maybe he couldn't fix the world, but he could still keep it moving, one engine at a time. The next few days passed quietly, though something about Daniel lingered in Earl's mind. There was something familiar in the young man's curiosity, a restlessness that reminded him of himself long ago. He wondered if Daniel would come back. He didn't have to wonder long. 3 mornings later, the Mercedes rolled up again, but this time, Daniel wasn't alone. A woman stepped out of the passenger seat, dressed neatly, her expression a mix of intrigue and skepticism. "Mr. Henderson," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Claire Hart. I'm with the Montgomery Times. Daniel here tells me you used to work for NASA." Earl froze, a wrench still in his hand. He shot Daniel a look. "You brought a reporter?" Daniel raised both hands. "Hear me out. I told her about your work, about what you did. She wants to write about you, about your life." "I'm not interested," Earl said flatly. He turned back to the open hood. But Claire didn't leave. Her tone softened. "Mr. Henderson, stories like yours don't come around often. You built engines that helped us touch the stars, and now you're here fixing the ones that keep us on the ground. Don't you think people should know that?" Earl closed the hood gently, wiped his hands, and faced her. "Ma'am, people don't need another story about the past. They need their cars to run. That's all." Claire studied him quietly. "Maybe, but I think they need reminders too, about the kind of people who built the world they take for granted." Earl sighed. He could see she wasn't going to give up easily. "You got a tape recorder?" She blinked, surprised. "Yes." "Then let's make this quick. But you write it the way it was, not the way people want to hear it." "Deal." Claire smiled. "Deal." As she began asking questions, Daniel leaned against the car, watching. Earl's answers were simple, almost reluctant, but every word carried weight. He spoke about the first hybrid rover prototype, about sleepless nights balancing thrust and power, about the day he realized no amount of innovation could survive when profit took over passion. Claire listened, transfixed. When the interview ended, she closed her notebook. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I think people will be moved by this." Earl nodded once. "If it makes them look under their hood once in a while instead of just replacing things, that'll do." They left soon after, the Mercedes vanishing again down the road. Earl stood there a long while, the warm wind lifting the edge of his shirt. For the first time in years, he felt the strange weight of being seen. It wasn't pride, it was vulnerability, the kind he'd forgotten how to carry. That night, he barely slept. The sound of the wind outside reminded him of rockets. He dreamt of fire and smoke, of countdowns and control rooms, of one last test that had never come. When he woke before dawn, his hands were trembling slightly, as if they still remembered the feel of ignition. He sat up, rubbed his face, and whispered into the dark, "Guess some engines never stop running." Outside, the first light of morning crept over the fields. The hum of life returned. Somewhere far down the road, Daniel was probably sitting at his office desk, and Claire was typing the first lines of her article. Earl could almost hear them. He poured himself a coffee and walked to the garage, ready for another day. What he didn't know was that the article would change everything. That soon, cars wouldn't be the only things pulling into his driveway. The morning came quiet, but it did not stay that way for long. The first sign that something had changed was the sound of car tires on gravel. Many of them. Earl Henderson looked up from his bench, where he'd been adjusting a carburetor spring, and saw a line of vehicles pulling into the dusty lot outside his garage. He frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. It wasn't unusual for him to get 3 or 4 customers on a busy day, but this looked like half the county had decided to visit at once. The first to step out was a middle-aged man in khakis holding a folded newspaper. Behind him came 2 younger men with cameras slung over their shoulders, their shirts already damp from the Alabama heat. Earl's stomach sank before the man even spoke. "Mr. Henderson," the man said, smiling. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. We just read the article in the Montgomery Times. Quite a story you've got there." Earl blinked. "Article?" The man held up the paper. On the front page, below the headline about city council funding, was a smaller photograph, the one Claire Hart had taken in front of his shop just 2 weeks ago. The headline read, "From NASA to Nowhere? The forgotten engineer who helped America touch the stars." Earl sighed softly, rubbing the back of his neck. So it had gone to print after all. He told Claire to keep it simple, to write about the work, not the man. But journalists had a way of finding poetry in things that didn't need it. He had no idea it would make him a local celebrity overnight. Mr. Henderson, the man continued, I work with a regional station, Channel 8. We'd love to do a short interview, maybe a follow-up. People are fascinated by your story. Earl set the rag down, his voice even but firm. I'm not interested in being anyone's story. Sir, with respect, you already are, the man said. That article's gone national. Folks from Huntsville to Houston are talking about you. NASA's communications office even mentioned your name in a press release this morning. That stopped him cold. He stared at the man. NASA? The reporter nodded. Apparently, they're reviewing some of the older propulsion data from your division. A few engineers said your hybrid engine notes were years ahead of their time. They'd like to reach out. Earl said nothing for a long moment. The air around him seemed heavier, full of ghosts he'd thought were buried. Finally, he exhaled. Tell them I'm busy fixing things that still need fixing. The reporter looked disappointed, but he nodded. Fair enough. Could we at least get a photo of you at work? Earl almost said no, but something in the man's tone, polite, almost reverent, softened him. Make it quick, he muttered. He turned back to the truck engine on his bench, tightening a bolt. The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing the grease-stained hands of a man who had once built engines for the stars. When they finally left, the lot was quiet again. Earl stood there, watching the dust settle. Inside the shop, the radio murmured softly, the local DJ's voice drifting through static. Well, folks, if you haven't read it yet, today's Montgomery Times features a story that'll make you proud to be from Alabama. Earl Henderson, one of NASA's forgotten heroes, has been right here among us all along. Earl turned off the radio. That night, the phone started ringing. First it was old colleagues, men he hadn't spoken to in decades, their voices cracking with age and disbelief. Earl, is it really you? We thought you'd vanished after the layoffs. Then came strangers, college students, journalists, mechanics, people who wanted advice, validation, or inspiration. He answered a few calls politely, ignored most. By midnight, he unplugged the phone and sat outside on his porch, staring into the dark. He didn't feel pride. He felt exposed. For 25 years, peace had meant invisibility. Now the world wanted to look backward again, to dig up memories he'd learned to let rest. Yet beneath the unease, a tiny ember stirred, the old thrill of relevance, of purpose. He hated that it still mattered. The next morning brought another visitor, one he didn't expect. The silver Mercedes rolled up again, but Daniel didn't step out right away. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at Earl through the windshield. When he finally emerged, he looked different. No suit this time, just jeans and a white shirt rolled to the elbows. He carried a small envelope. Morning, Mr. Earl, he said quietly. Morning, son. You here to apologize for that article? Daniel smiled sheepishly. Sort of, but also to give you this. He held out the envelope. Inside was a printed letter on NASA letterhead. Earl's name was right there, typed neatly beneath the words Historical Engineering Recognition Program. He frowned, scanning it. They wanted to honor him. An official ceremony, recognition for pioneering contributions to hybrid propulsion design. It was the kind of letter that would have made his younger self tremble with pride. Now it just made him tired. You told him about me, he said. Daniel nodded. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just thought, maybe you'd want to know that they remember. That what you did still matters. Earl folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Things don't matter just because people remember them. They matter because they worked. Daniel hesitated. Maybe, but some things deserve to be remembered and seen. Earl studied him for a moment, then asked, You ever build anything with your own hands? Daniel shook his head. Not really. I work in finance. Earl smiled thinly. Figures. You got clean hands. But someday, when the world breaks something you care about, and no one knows how to fix it, you'll wish you'd learned how to listen. The words hung in the air between them. Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded quietly. If it means anything, Mr. Earl, the article's done a lot of good. There's a GoFundMe running to restore your old NASA prototype, the one they kept in Huntsville. People want to bring it back to working condition. They're calling it the Henderson engine. That made Earl laugh, a deep, warm laugh that startled even him. They name an engine after me, and it's one that never flew. Figures. But later that day, after Daniel left, Earl found himself standing by the window, staring out toward the open road and thinking of that machine. He could still see it clearly, the shape of its combustion chamber, the delicate balance between electric thrust and thermal flow, the way it had hummed during testing like something alive. They'd never gotten to finish it. The shutdown had come too soon. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving. The next few weeks were a blur. Letters arrived from universities. NASA's engineering team sent him archived blueprints to review for historical preservation. Journalists dropped by, some respectful, some pushy. Earl tried to keep his routine the same. Open the shop at 8, close at 6, but the quiet rhythm of his days was gone. Still, a part of him felt alive again, like an old engine finally finding spark. One evening, as he was closing up, a truck pulled in. A tall man in his 40s stepped out, carrying a small metal case. "You, Earl Henderson?" he asked. "That's what it says on the sign." The man grinned. "Name's Cole. I'm with the restoration project in Huntsville. Thought I'd save you the drive." He opened the case and lifted something wrapped in cloth. A small component, half burned, half beautiful. Recognize it? Earl did. His heart clenched. It was the throttle module from his prototype, the same one he'd tested 30 years ago. "Where'd you get this?" "Storage unit near the test site. Figured you'd want to see it before we start rebuilding." Earl took the piece in his hands. The metal was cold, scarred with age, but when he ran his fingers across it, he felt the same pulse he had the night it first roared to life. "She's still breathing?" he whispered. Cole looked at him curiously. "You talk about engines like they're people." Earl smiled. "Some people deserve less sympathy than engines do." They worked side by side for hours, cleaning, studying, planning. Cole explained that the team wanted Earl's input, how to stabilize the hybrid cycle, how to calibrate the energy regulators. At first, Earl resisted the idea of getting involved. But by midnight, he was sketching diagrams on a grease-stained notepad, his hands moving faster than they had in years. The next morning, he packed a small bag. When the neighbors saw him locking up the shop, they asked if he was closing down. "Just stepping out for a bit," he said. "Got an old friend that needs tuning." He drove to Huntsville in an old pickup that rattled like a tin can, the throttle module on the seat beside him. The closer he got, the more memories stirred. The control towers, the vast hangars, the endless hum of ambition. The gates had changed, security tighter, buildings taller, but the air smelled the same. Metal, ozone, and dreams. When he walked into the restoration hangar, the younger engineers looked up like they were seeing a ghost. Someone handed him a hard hat. Someone else offered coffee. He ignored both and walked straight to the frame of the unfinished prototype. It was still there, dusty, incomplete, but unmistakably his. "Let's hear her," he said. They stared at him. "Sir, it's not operational yet." "Then let's make it operational." For the next several days, Earl became something of a legend among the restoration crew. The man who had once built engines that touched the stars was back at work. Moving like time had turned backward. He corrected equations, reconfigured circuits, adjusted calibrations by feel instead of formulas. The younger engineers watched in awe as he listened, literally listened, to the hum of the machinery and made micro-adjustments that improved efficiency beyond what their simulations had predicted. At night, when the others left, he stayed behind, staring at the vast, skeletal form of the engine. It reminded him of himself, unfinished but still capable of roaring back to life. One night, Daniel showed up unexpectedly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You never stop, do you?" he said, smiling. Earl didn't look up. Engines don't rest. Neither should the men who build them. Daniel handed him the cup. "They're saying this thing might actually run again. That could be displayed live at the Space and Science Expo next month. They want you there when they fire it up." Earl chuckled. "You just want me to make sure it doesn't explode." Daniel grinned. "That too." When the day finally came, the hangar was filled with reporters, engineers, and old NASA veterans who remembered Earl from the old days. Claire was there too, notebook in hand, her eyes bright with pride. The air buzzed with anticipation. Earl stood near the control panel, his hand resting on the throttle. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8, He closed his eyes, feeling the vibration through the floor, the memory of a lifetime in motion. 3, 2, 1, ignition. The engine roared to life. The hangar trembled. For a moment, everyone forgot to breathe. The machine that had once been left to rust sang again, its sound pure, balanced, alive. Earl's eyes shimmered in the light of its flame. He whispered to no one in particular, still running. When the noise finally subsided, the room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Earl just stood there, watching the engine cool, a small smile on his face. He didn't need the applause. The machine had spoken for him, just as it always had. Later that night, long after the crowds left, he walked out of the hangar and into the Alabama night. The stars were bright, clearer than they'd been in years. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, sipping cold coffee, looking up. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Not because the world had remembered him, but because he'd remembered himself. He looked toward the distant horizon, where the faint glow of Montgomery lay waiting. He would go back soon, to his little shop, to the quiet engines that still needed him. But for tonight, he let the silence stretch. He whispered into the sky, "You hear that, old girl? We made it." And somewhere between the stars and the soft hum of the earth below, it almost felt like the universe answered back. The applause had long faded, yet its echo lingered in Earl's chest like a vibration that refused to quiet. That night, after the crowd had dispersed, he found himself walking the length of the empty hangar, the soles of his boots clicking softly against the concrete. The massive hybrid engine, his engine, sat in the middle of the room, still warm, a faint wisp of smoke curling up from its core. Every inch of metal seemed alive again, and for the first time in decades, he saw his life reflected in something that wasn't broken. But the noise, the cameras, the handshakes, they were all distractions. What mattered was that she had run again, pure and strong. Machines didn't lie. They either breathed or they didn't. And tonight, she breathed. Outside, the night air hit him cool and sharp. The world beyond the hangar was dark and quiet. He stepped out into the open field, letting the hum of cicadas replace the roar of engines. The stars overhead stretched endlessly, like old friends waiting for him to speak. He sat down on the tailgate of his truck and watched them for a long time, the same way he used to as a boy on his father's farm. Back then, he'd look up and wonder what kind of machines could ever reach those glittering points of light. Now, at 79, he'd built one and watched it die and live again. When dawn broke, the first rays of light poured across the tarmac, gilding the edges of the hangar and catching the silver in Earl's hair. The young engineers who had stayed overnight were already stirring, huddled over data sheets and graphs, speaking in low, excited voices. When they saw him, they straightened, offering nods of respect. He gave a small one in return. He'd never been much for speeches or attention. His lessons had always been passed through motion, through the turn of a wrench or the hum of a well-tuned motor. One of the engineers, Cole, approached, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. "Didn't think you'd still be here," he said. Earl accepted the cup with a small smile. "Never leave before the engine cools. She might still have something to say." Cole grinned, shaking his head. "You really do treat them like they're alive, huh?" Earl sipped the coffee. "They are in their own way. You just have to listen." He walked back into the hangar, tracing his fingers along the smooth metal casing. The NASA representatives were expected later that morning for an official ceremony. Speeches, plaques, cameras, all the things he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. He wasn't sure why they insisted. Maybe it was guilt, maybe nostalgia, or maybe it was just easier to celebrate the past than fix the present. By noon, the hangar was buzzing again. A podium stood near the engine, adorned with the NASA logo. Claire was there, her notepad in hand, the same sharp look of curiosity in her eyes. Daniel stood beside her, dressed neatly this time, but still managing to look slightly out of place among the engineers. When he spotted Earl, he smiled and waved. Earl nodded back, though his expression was unreadable. The ceremony began with the usual speeches. Words like innovation, legacy, inspiration floated through the air. People clapped at the right moments, cameras flashed, and the politicians smiled for the headlines they'd write later. When they finally handed Earl the microphone, the crowd fell into an expectant hush. He looked at the faces before him, some young and eager, others gray and remembering. He didn't have a speech prepared. Never had. So he spoke the only way he knew how, plainly. I spent most of my life trying to make engines that could take people farther than they'd ever gone, he began. Turns out, distance isn't just about miles. It's about time. It's about people who keep something alive even after the world stops caring. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the engine behind him. I didn't come back here for glory. I came back because something unfinished doesn't sit right with me. You don't abandon what still has a chance to run. There was silence, the kind that comes when truth lands heavier than applause. Then, slowly, the clapping began, soft, sincere, not the stage kind. Earl stepped back, nodded once, and walked away from the podium. He didn't need to hear more. After the ceremony, reporters crowded around him, questions flying like sparks. How does it feel to be rediscovered? What's next for you? Do you regret leaving NASA? He answered none of them. Instead, he turned to Claire, who had been waiting patiently. You got what you came for, he said. She smiled softly. No, Mr. Henderson. I think I got more than that. He started to walk away, but she called after him. What will you do now? He looked back, eyes squinting against the sunlight. Same thing I've always done. Keep things running. That evening, he drove back to Montgomery. The highway stretched endless and quiet beneath the dying sun. As the miles rolled by, the world began to shrink again, from the vastness of rockets and ceremonies to the small, familiar rhythm of his little garage. When he pulled into the lot, the sign caught the fading light just right. Earl's Auto Fix, tire patching, oil change, nothing fancy. We listen to engines. He chuckled under his breath. The paint had already begun to peel again. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Tools neatly arranged, the air thick with the smell of oil and dust. He hung his jacket, turned on the radio, and let the low hum of blues fill the room. The world had moved on, but here, time stood still. He poured himself a glass of sweet tea, sat on the stool by the window, and watched as the last light slipped away. The next morning, a knock on the door broke the silence. Earl opened it to find a woman standing there. A stranger, but not quite. She carried a worn box in her arms and a nervous smile on her face. Mr. Henderson? She asked. My name's Amelia. My father, Robert, used to work with you. He passed away a few months ago. He wanted you to have this. Earl took the box gently. Inside were old papers, blueprints, and a photo of him and Robert standing side by side in front of an early prototype. He felt something tighten in his chest. Good man, he murmured. Hard worker. He kept the line steady when the rest of us were chasing ideas. Amelia smiled. He said you taught him that machines have souls. Earl laughed softly. He must have been desperate for wisdom if he remembered that. They talked for a while, sharing stories, small details that stitched old memories into new understanding. When she left, she shook his hand. Thank you for keeping his spirit alive, she said. After she drove away, Earl sat for a long time staring at the photo. It wasn't fame or recognition that filled him. It was something quieter, something more profound. Legacy wasn't built in applause. It lived in the hands that carried your lessons forward. That night, Daniel called. Mr. Earl, they're putting together a special exhibit at the Space and Science Center. Your engine, the restored notes, even your tools. They want to name it the Henderson Propulsion Wing. Earl smiled faintly into the phone. I told them not to make a fuss. I think this time it's not about fuss. It's about respect, Daniel said. Earl didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the shelf where his old NASA badge lay, next to the folded letter from the recognition ceremony. Tell them I'll send something better than speeches, he finally said. What's that? Daniel asked. Blueprints, Earl replied. For something new. Maybe they'll listen this time. He hung up and went to his workbench. For hours, he sketched, erased, and re-sketched, his mind alive with the kind of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The design wasn't for rockets or rovers. It was for a new kind of hybrid engine, one meant for trucks and buses, built to run cleaner, longer, simpler. Something for the people he'd lived among all this time. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent a lifetime helping machines fly, and now he was designing one to keep them grounded. But maybe that was the point. The sky didn't need him anymore. The earth still did. Days turned into weeks. The sketches became models. Daniel visited often, helping where he could, learning the old ways, how to listen, how to feel the difference between a working rhythm and a failing one. They spent long hours covered in grease, drinking bad coffee, and talking about everything except money or fame. One afternoon, as they worked in the late light, Daniel said quietly, I think you're teaching me more than any classroom ever could." Earl smirked. "Good. Just don't start charging tuition." As the sun dipped low, painting the walls in amber light, the new engine coughed, sputtered, then came alive with a steady hum. Earl closed his eyes, listening. Perfect balance. Perfect harmony. He smiled, the lines on his face softening. "There she is," he whispered. Daniel watched him, eyes shining. "What do you go to call it?" Earl thought for a long moment. "Nothing fancy," he said finally. "Just something that runs." They laughed together, the sound carrying out into the quiet Alabama evening. That night, as the two men locked up the shop, the air felt lighter somehow. The sky above shimmered with stars, just as it had the night Earl walked away from NASA all those years ago. He looked up once more, and instead of feeling small beneath them, he felt connected, as if the stars had followed him home. He whispered under his breath, still running. Then he turned off the light, closed the door, and let the night embrace him. But the story wasn't done. In the weeks to come, that humble engine would catch the attention of more than just local mechanics. And once again, the man who never chased recognition would find himself standing at the crossroads of invention and purpose. Only this time, the world would be listening differently. The new engine settled into the room like a steady heartbeat, quiet but undeniable, and in the late summer light the shop seemed to breathe along with it. Earl stood with one hand on the workbench and the other resting lightly on the casing, feeling the faint hum travel through his palm and into his bones. The sound was a conversation older than his memory, metal speaking in patience and balance, the small ceremony of motion contained and given purpose. He didn't smile big, he never did, but something inside him eased, like a knot finally loosening after years of stubbornness. It ran. Not pretty, not fancy, just honest. That was enough. Word passed through the town the way good news always does, not as a shout, but as a fine thread, a voice in a grocery line, a laugh at the barber's chair, the clink of a coffee mug on a diner counter. Before long, a city bus limped in at dusk, paint sun-faded and panels rattling. The driver killed the ignition and climbed down with an embarrassed shrug. "They said you might take a listen," he said, as if asking for directions instead of a miracle. Earl rolled up the bay door, motioned him in, and the bus fit with inches to spare, the ceiling lights reflected as bent constellations across its long windows. He scraped his knuckles twice that night and bled into a rag without noticing, because the engine's cough told him more truth than pain ever could. Near midnight, he reached past a tangle of lines and pressed a joint tight, then backed away and told the driver to try. The idle steadied. The driver slapped the wheel and laughed into the empty bus. Earl only nodded. The shop smelled like warm metal and rain. The bus left. 2 weeks later, a second one appeared, then a third. Somewhere inside a windowless office, the city council argued over procurement. But on the street, the mechanics from the depot swapped their shirt sleeves for rolled forearms and came to learn how to listen. At first, they stood back while Earl worked and Daniel handed him tools, names growing short with familiar use, Phillips' half-inch torque bar, until even Daniel began to anticipate passing the right weight into the right hand at the right moment. Soon Earl stepped aside and let the younger men take the bolts and brackets. He didn't hover. He just tilted his head and listened, then made a 2-finger motion to the left or a small circle in the air, and they understood. It was the strangest classroom. Doors open to the yard, birds hopping across the gravel, coffee perched on the radiator of a truck that hadn't run in 15 years, and a chalkboard that was nothing but a patch of wall primed with faded paint, where Earl drew pressure loops and labeled them with block letters that had never learned to hurry. Claire came by sometimes with her small recorder and her respectful silence. She didn't write as often now. She watched instead. A sentence might find her days later at the grocery store, and she'd leave her basket near the oranges and walk out into the parking lot to write it down before it escaped. "He teaches with his hands," she wrote, "and the hands he teaches begin to move like his." She showed him the line one afternoon under the pecan tree, while the buses idled in a gentle row and the air smelled like diesel and sap. He read it once, twice, folded the paper carefully, and gave it back. "Right about the buses," he said. "Those wheels carry groceries and grandmothers." Hear the story. Daniel stopped wearing suits to the shop. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes. He started bringing lunch in paper sacks, peanut butter and grape jelly, 2 napkins tucked inside, and an apple always carved with a pocket knife into neat crescents that he passed around the table in the back. He still drove the Mercedes, but he no longer compared its lacquered quiet to the honest chatter of a city bus. They were both machines, and he'd learned to greet each with the same open regard. There were still emails, still spreadsheets somewhere that called for him, still numbers stacking into towers, but he didn't mistake those towers for buildings anyone could live inside. In the evenings, he kept a notebook in his kitchen drawer where he wrote down what Earl said, not as quotes, but as the engine of a different life. Pride's not the paint, one page read. It's whether the thing you built holds together when nobody's clapping. News of the engine, Earl's humble, human-scaled hybrid, slipped outward along those same fine threads, now crossing county lines. A community college asked if he would visit their automotive class. He walked into a room that smelled like new rubber and anxious ambition and stood very still until the students quieted themselves. He spoke softly about airflow and patience and the weird mercy of second chances. When a boy in the back, hands too clean, eyes too tired, asked how you know if you should keep trying or throw the whole thing out and start over, Earl said, "If you've got a part that still remembers the job it was born to do, you keep it. If all it knows how to do is fight the rest, thank it for its time and let it go." The boy nodded like the words had landed somewhere the engine could not. A season turned. The shop sign weathered back from bright to merely honest. The bus fleet changed its route cards, and a few of them grew quiet at idle in a way riders noticed without knowing why. Babies slept through more lights. Conversations didn't require raised voices, and an elderly woman who'd given up reading on her way to the clinic took her book from her purse again and underlined a sentence she could not explain later but never forgot. A letter arrived from a small town 3 hours away, where the county line bent like a crooked elbow around a river, asking if Earl might come see the school buses that kept dying on cold mornings. He went. The buses did not die that winter. NASA sent a formal invitation to give a guest talk to a cohort of engineers who had read his papers from the archive and whispered his name in hallways like a habit, trying to become gratitude. He said no twice before he said yes. Not for recognition, but because he remembered what had once been given to him for nothing more than the casual price of attention. Men leaning over a bench to talk in short sentences freighted with care, the way you talk when time is money but wisdom is grace. He wore the same denim shirt and took nothing to the podium but a grease pencil. He drew a rectangle and wrote across it, "Make it want to live." The room laughed at first, then quieted, then wrote it down. At home, the porch boards creaked in the evenings under the weight of small rituals. Earl would sit with a glass of sweet tea, sweating on the railing, and watch the sparrows harass the hawk that circled too low over the field. The radio crackled with blues that had learned to keep company with silence. Sometimes the Jenkins boy dropped by with a bicycle chain that had learned a new trick for opening itself, and Earl fixed it with a patience that had nothing to prove. He had begun to sleep deeper, to wake without the old quick scan for lost deadlines. And when he dreamed, it was of hands turning bolts in unison, many hands younger than his. He and Daniel finished the second version of the hybrid, a refinement not of pride, but of compassion. It used less, wasted less, asked less of the operator, and gave more in return. They installed it in a county maintenance truck that had already served longer than anyone expected, and the truck went about its days with the same stubborn dignity as before, only quieter, like a man who'd found a way to breathe that didn't hurt. A mechanic from the depot climbed into the cab afterward and sat for a long minute with his hands on the wheel and his eyes closed. "Feels like somebody apologized," he said, and Earl understood. A museum exhibit opened with a ribbon and a podium and earnest words. Children pressed their hands to the glass that held Earl's old tools, their fingers leaving small eclipses of warmth. In one corner, a screen played a loop of the restored NASA engine, lighting once more, a bloom of controlled fire that made even the most fidgeting child go still. At the end of the hall, a simple plaque bore Earl's name and the word propulsion, and nothing else because that seemed right, like naming a river and letting it run. People started asking Earl bigger questions, the sort that forgets to hide their hunger behind polite adjectives. What is legacy? What is enough? He had no interest in answers that turned into slogans. He said, "Legacy is the bolt that doesn't rattle loose on a gravel road, and enough is when someone else can take it from here." The bigger questions shrank to a size a human could carry. The world kept moving. That was the point. One afternoon, a boy from the high school auto club rolled into the yard in a car he'd cobbled together from hope and salvage. The idol shook like a skittish horse. He stepped out and spoke too fast. "Sir, if you have time, if you don't, I can come back, but Earl held up a hand, and the words fell neatly to the ground like wrenches placed exactly where they'd be needed later. They lifted the hood together. The heat waved up and brought with it the faint copper smell of electricity doing its best. Earl listened, pointed once, and said, "You're chasing the wrong ghost." They found the right one. The boy learned the taste of relief that comes when a problem tells you its true name. He drove away with both hands light on the wheel, as if he were carrying a bowl of water filled to the brim. Toward fall, the nights cooled, and the mornings came on like a hell breath. The pecan tree let go in measured gestures, one nut dropping at a time, making small domestic thuds on the roof of the shop. Earl kept a broom by the door and swept the steps every morning without thinking. His shoulder ached a little more. His knees narrated themselves when he stood up too quickly. He took to resting mid-afternoon on the stool by the window, the one worn to the shape of the patients he had stored there for years. When Daniel noticed and tried to do the sweeping himself, Earl waved him off once and then led him the second time, because he was learning too. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day nobody chooses for ceremony, which made it perfect. The city had sent a small group to see the latest bus retrofitted with the modest brilliance of the Henderson hybrid. They wore shirts with embroidered logos and carried clipboards as if against an unexpected wind. Earl stood with them, neither leading nor trailing, just present as the driver turned the key. The engine caught and settled. Even the clipboards seemed to relax in the men's hands. Someone, surprised by their own honesty, said, "It sounds polite." A laugh, quiet and shared. The driver eased the bus forward and then back, testing something he would never name. Earl watched his eyes change. The group shook hands and dispersed. The bus turned onto the road and became, almost immediately, simply part of the day. After they left, the lot went back to its real work, holding sun and shadow and the occasional feather caught in a swirl of heat. Earl sat on the step with his elbows on his knees and felt the pleasant ache that comes from labor honestly done. Daniel sat beside him and offered him an orange slice from a paper napkin. They ate in silence. "You ever think about what you would have done if none of it had changed?" Daniel asked. He didn't say NASA. He didn't have to. Earl considered the question as one considers a gasket, by its fit. "Something would have broken," he said. "Not a part. Me. I needed to hear the other kind of engines, the kind that bring a woman to her doctor and a kid to his reading lesson and a tired man home in time for supper. I didn't know that then. I was listening too high up." He squeezed the orange peel and watched the mist spark in the sun. Took me a while to tune the frequency. They returned to work. A timing belt claimed their attention for an hour, a stubborn bolt for another 20 minutes, a story shared by a customer about her late husband for 10 more. They fixed the thing that could be fixed and stood companion to the thing that couldn't. The day lengthened and sloped toward evening. Claire came at dusk with a man and a woman in tow. City planners, it turned out, carrying a map folded into a complicated geometry. They talked about route redesign and fuel rebates and a pilot program with 5 more buses, and then, almost shyly, a scholarship fund for local students who wanted to study engine technology without leaving the county. The man said the fund was named after a donor who preferred to stay anonymous. The woman looked at Daniel for an extra beat that made anonymity a polite fiction. Earl pretended not to notice, which was its own kind of gratitude. He signed nothing. He blessed everything with a nod. Later, when the light was nearly gone and only the radiance of the open bay made the gravel glow, the Jenkins boy arrived pushing something that was hardly a bicycle anymore, more idea than machine. "She's dying, Mr. Earl," he said, as if announcing a weather front. "Then we'll teach her how to live different," Earl replied. And they did, scavenging a chain from a box under the bench, truing a wheel with the gentlest insults, oiling what would accept oil and replacing what would not. The boy rode 2 tentative circles in the yard, then 5, then shot down the road with his laughter thrown over his shoulder like a scarf. He came back breathless to say thank you, and then stumbled over his own gratitude, until Earl cut him free with the mercy of acceptance. "You'll pass it along when it's your turn," he said. "That's the whole trick." Night set in. They closed the bay and turned the sign to the side that did not know the word closed, but performed its function anyway. Daniel locked the door, then remembered something and unlocked it again and fetched the rag he'd left by the vise. It was an unimportant act performed with the seriousness of care. Claire stood out by the road, looking back at the shop the way people look at a house where they have been fed. She lifted a hand without turning and got in her car and drove away. Earl sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees because the wind had remembered how to be wind. He could tell the temperature by how long it took the tea glass to stop sweating and the time by the way the freight train dragged its sound across the town. He could tell what tomorrow would ask just by the smell of the night. What metal wanted, what rubber feared, what electricity promised and couldn't keep without help. He did not feel large under the stars. He felt correctly sized. He spoke to them anyway. "We did what we could," he said, and the darkness answered in crickets and a distant screen door and the soft scuff of a dog rearranging itself on a porch 2 houses down. In the weeks that followed, the museum kept collecting small offerings from the town without quite knowing how to catalog them. Thank you notes folded into shapes, a bus transfer clipped to a ribbon, a hand-drawn diagram of a carburetor from a kid who had felt the shape of respect for the first time. The Henderson wing began to look like a kitchen fridge covered in magnets and crayon drawings. Slightly messy, absolutely alive. A docent tried to tidy it and then, wisely, stopped. Earl returned to Huntsville once more, not for a ceremony, but to walk along a corridor where an intern had mounted a timeline of propulsion experiments and found a gap the size of a life. She had put his name there not as a headline, but as a hinge, the place where 2 ways of doing work, hands and numbers, learn how to speak without contempt. He touched the laminate with 2 fingers, felt nothing of course, and everything. The engine in his shop ran every morning now for a few minutes like a prayer, not to ask for anything, only to declare gratitude for breath. He listened to it the way some men read scripture, head bowed, attention undivided, corrected by what did not flatter him. He found a flaw one Tuesday and corrected it on Thursday and told Daniel on Friday why it had mattered on Wednesday. They laughed, and the joke was only funny because it was wrapped around something true. Winter came again, but this time it was gentler. Pipes had been insulated, bus heaters maintained, batteries swapped before they failed, the quiet miracle of remembering done in time instead of too late. The shop kept its warmth by means of a space heater that had long ago learned the art of not becoming the center of attention. They ate stew from a pot someone's aunt had sent over and debated whether a particular squeal was belt or bearing and then let the engine decide. The letter announcing a national award arrived on plain stationery that tried to act modest and failed. Daniel read it aloud and then looked up to see what the moment required. "If I go," Earl said, "it'll be to thank the people who kept showing up when nobody was looking." He did go. He said those words. They were quoted badly and remembered well. And then, As it always does when a story is ready, the town stopped needing to say his name in every sentence. The engine became the engine, the buses became the buses, the work became the work again. This was not forgetting. This was integration. The thing had entered the muscles of the place and could be lifted without ceremony. That, more than any plaque or podium, felt like honor. One quiet afternoon, the sky low and white with a kind of light that made edges kind, Earl found himself alone in the shop. Daniel had gone to the depot to return a borrowed tool. Claire had taken a drive along the river with her window down and her recorder off. The Jenkins boy was at practice insisting, to anyone who would listen, that a bicycle chain, properly cleaned, was a kind of poem. The engine was off. The radio was off. The town idled beyond the fence. Earl sat on his stool and let the stillness have him whole. He took the old NASA badge from the shelf and held it in his hand as one holds a small, polished stone found on a beach where someone once said yes. He set the badge down, stood, and walked to the engine. He placed his palm on the casing and waited. He felt the echo of heat stored from the morning's run, the memory of motion living inside quiet metal. He thought of his father saying, "Listen, boy." He thought of the man he had been, living too high up for too long. He thought of the buses, the school children, the old woman underlining a sentence she would not be able to explain. He thought of the way an orange peel sparks in the sun when you squeeze it just right. He spoke aloud, not for the engine and not for himself, but for the room, which had always kept his secrets faithfully. "You did good," he said. He meant the engine. He meant the town. He meant the boy who learned to name the right ghost, and the driver who felt an apology in his bones, and the woman who made stew for men she only knew by their grease. He meant Daniel, standing between numbers and hands and refusing to choose. He meant the man who had walked away from the stars and found them, at last, beneath the grease. He turned out the lights and stepped into evening. The pecan tree held the last of its leaves the way an old friend holds the last minutes of a long goodbye, without tightening, without fear. The road ran past the shop and on toward everywhere. A bus glided by and did not rattle the window glass. A boy laughed on a bicycle not worth much and entirely priceless. Somewhere, a train lay its line of sound across the town, and somebody at the museum straightened a small note left in crayon. "Thank you for fixing the loud bus so my baby sleeps." Earl stood at the edge of the porch and breathed once, deeply. The air carried a little cold, enough to remind him that breath is a thing granted one moment at a time. He went inside to put on a sweater that had learned his shape, came back out, and sat. He did not check a clock. He did not make a list. He let the world happen in front of him as if it trusted him to witness it without rearranging it. The first star found the sky, then another. He did not count them. He only nodded as if an old agreement had been kept. When the wind eased, he could hear the bus far off, and for a wonder it sounded like ocean. He thought about the parts inside, asking nothing more dramatic than grease at the right place and pressure within reason and a hand that would listen when they forgot how to ask. He thought about tomorrow, which would come to his door carrying a small problem wrapped in brown paper, and he would untie it carefully and give it back lighter. He closed his eyes and rested his hands on his knees and said, as he had said so many times he could not remember the first, still running. In the morning he would sweep the steps, and a new driver would come early because he was nervous about a rattle that had learned to hide under acceleration. And Daniel would arrive with 2 coffees and no tie, and Claire would leave a bag of biscuits on the bench with a note that said only for the men who listen. The museum would open its doors to a school group who would treat the place like a map that folded into their pockets. Somewhere a council would approve 5 more retrofits, and a kid would discover that a properly seated bearing feels like forgiveness. For now, there was only the porch, the blanket, the stars, and the quiet insistence of a life aligned with its work. The engines of the town slept, their heat drifting off in thin curls that rose, lost their names, and entered the night. The world, with all its clatter and sorrow, turned with them, and in that turning there was room for small mercies, for laughter near a lifted hood, for a bolt that did not rattle loose on a gravel road, for an old man who had learned the measure of enough. And in that wide, ordinary peace, where rockets and buses and bicycles belong to the same country of motion. Earl Henderson kept his gentle covenant with the day behind him and the day ahead, and let the dark carry him kindly toward morning.